She was told her uniform made people uncomfortable, so she came back the next day flying a $90 million fighter jet straight over their heads. Tamika Daniels had been up since 4:45 a.m. She was used to early mornings. That's when the sky was still quiet and belonged only to the few people in the world who knew how to navigate it. She adjusted the collar of her flight suit and looked in the mirror. Crisp, clean, tight tuck. She ran one hand down the side of her patch. Her squadron's insignia sat above her name. Major T. Daniels. It wasn't vanity. It was pride. And that pride had been earned. Every sleepless night in training, every mistake she'd been told she wasn't allowed to make twice, every moment where she knew someone was watching to see if the only black woman in the squadron would slip. Now she was stepping into a private aerospace conference hosted just outside Tonopah, Nevada. The kind of event where generals and engineers sipped lattes and whispered about defense contracts while standing next to mock-ups of drones worth more than homes. She wasn't there to impress. She was there because she was invited, officially, as a liaison between the U.S. Air Force and the tech world. When she arrived, a few heads turned. Not many uniforms in the room, and definitely not hers. Her flight suit didn't match the sea of tailored jackets and navy blue dresses, and she wasn't naive enough to think they didn't notice. She made her way to the registration table, where a man wearing a name badge and khaki blazer looked up. "Hi, welcome. Are you here with logistics?" "No, Major Tamika Daniels. I'm speaking at the 11:30 panel on coalition integration." The man blinked. He glanced at his clipboard. "Right, just one moment." He stepped aside to talk to someone, a woman with perfectly ironed hair and clipped tones. They both looked over at Tamika, and then the woman approached. She didn't introduce herself. "I'm sorry, Major, but this event is business attire only." Tamika raised an eyebrow. "This is my business attire." The woman smiled with tight lips. "We completely understand, but we're trying to maintain a certain tone for the attendees. Perhaps you can step out and change. There's a restroom around the corner." Tamika took a slow breath. "I was invited here to represent my unit. This isn't just a uniform. It's who I am. I understand," the woman said again, but her voice had that brittle edge that said she didn't. "It might be less distracting if we stick to the dress code. I'm sure you understand." She didn't say anything else. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or demand anything. Tamika just gave one small nod, just enough to signal that she heard her. Then she turned and walked away. She never even reached the coffee station. Out in the parking lot, she got into her rental car. The air inside was dry, and the seat still held the sun's heat. She looked straight ahead, hands on the steering wheel, thinking. This wasn't new. Not really. Different setting, same message. You're not one of us. But the thing was, she didn't need to be. She pulled out her phone, found a number in her contacts labeled QOL, Lefebvre, France, and pressed call. It rang once, then twice. Then someone picked up on the other side of the world. But no one at that conference had any idea what that call would lead to. Colonel Arnaud Lefebvre hadn't changed. His voice still had that heavy French growl, like gravel under pressure, and his laugh still broke through even the driest military briefings. "Tamika," he said, "I didn't expect a call from you so soon. What's going on?" "I need a favor," she said. "Is this about training or trouble?" "Depends on how you define trouble." She gave him the rundown in a few sentences. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The colonel didn't ask her to repeat it. He simply said, "Let me make a few calls. I'll text you the rest." She hung up and sat there in silence for a minute, phone still in hand. And in that quiet, her mind drifted, like it always did, back to where this journey started. Tamika grew up in Converse, Texas, a place where the air smelled like dust and rubber, and people got up early, whether they had somewhere to go or not. Her mom was a nurse. Her dad fixed helicopters at the Randolph Air Force Base. She used to sit on the porch after school and watch jets split the clouds. At 11, she told her parents she was going to be a pilot. Her dad just nodded, didn't blink, didn't laugh. "Then you'll need to be better than good." he said. Because you're going to walk into rooms where no one wants you there, and you'll still have to fly like you belong. She didn't forget that. By 17, she was the only girl in her school's Air Force JROTC program. She didn't miss a drill, and when her instructor, Sergeant Bishop, handed her the guidebook for the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, he didn't sugarcoat it. Long shot, he said, but not impossible. Getting in was hell. Staying in was worse. Some of the instructors called her Ms. Daniels, even when they called her white peers by their rank. She kept her room inspection perfect. She ran in the snow until her legs went numb. She flew through classroom simulations while some of her classmates openly questioned if she was there on diversity points. She graduated top 8% of her class. She didn't celebrate, just packed, boarded the shuttle to her next assignment, and showed up the next day like it was just another Tuesday. First combat mission was in Djibouti. She was 28, flying an F-16 as lead escort for a NATO recon drone. When her second wingman got hit by ground fire, she didn't wait for orders. She rerouted, picked up comms, and escorted the injured bird out of enemy airspace like a ghost with teeth. Her crew made it home. After that, people stopped asking if she was qualified. They just started watching her closer. And then came the invitation to train with the French Air and Space Force as part of a multi-nation fighter exchange. That's where she met Lefebvre, and that's when she first flew the Rafale. It wasn't just another fighter jet. It responded like it had nerves. Subtle, sharp, fast. Fewer pilots in the US got to fly it than there were senators in Congress. But she flew it. Logged dozens of hours. Mastered maneuvers even some of the French aces struggled with. She wasn't the kind of pilot they used for recruitment posters. No glossy smiles, no background orchestra. She was the one they called when the mission couldn't fail. So when she sat there in her rental car in that Nevada parking lot, looking out at a corporate compound full of people who couldn't be bothered to ask her name before asking her to leave, she didn't feel small. She felt clear. These people hadn't rejected her. They'd exposed themselves. But while they dismissed a woman in a uniform, they hadn't met the one who wore it like armor. Inside the sleek steel and glass walls of the conference center, nothing seemed out of place. Neutral colors, clean lines, security with earpieces, waiters circling with tiny plates of lamb skewers and sparkling water. No one was really there to mingle. This was business disguised as conversation. Echelon Aerotech had built its name on advanced drone systems and propulsion upgrades for the Air Force and NATO partners. But now they were trying to stretch higher. Next-gen fighter integration, autonomous combat swarms, and private air dominance contracts. This event wasn't just about panels. It was about who you stood next to when they wrote checks with 8 digits. The floor buzzed. Light, measured talk about lithium weights, radar absorption, private equity. Near the East display, 3 engineers from the company's Phoenix office were analyzing a scale model of the experimental Orion drone. Across the floor, Marissa Givens, the same coordinator who'd turned Tameka away, smiled wide for a handshake with a retired Air Force colonel who now worked as a defense advisor for a private lobbying firm. "We're thrilled to host this year's Exchange Summit," she said. "Everything's running smoothly." He leaned in slightly. "Saw you had a moment earlier with one of the military reps." "Just a misunderstanding," she said smoothly. "It's important the tone here stays consistent. Some optics don't translate well to investors." He nodded, unfazed. "Understood. These days you blink the wrong way and someone's viral." They shared a quiet chuckle. Nearby, a 26-year-old intern named Brian Qualls stood awkwardly near a 3D map of a joint training operation in Nevada. He'd only been with Echelon for 3 weeks, hired after finishing a degree in aerospace engineering from Purdue. He was one of 3 black employees at the company. When he'd seen Major Daniels earlier, tall, poised, no nonsense, he felt something shift, like finally seeing someone who'd fought their way through the same wall he'd been bumping his head against silently. But now she was gone. One of the engineers leaned over to Brian and whispered, "Don't worry, man. She didn't fit the vibe anyway." Brian laughed politely. He always did. But he felt the heat crawl behind his ears. Back in the main hall, attendees gathered around a projection showing tomorrow's aircraft demonstration. A smooth male voice narrated, "Scheduled for 10:30 a.m. multi-nation display including Italian Eurofighters, Canadian F-35s, and a surprise entry from France's Dassault aviation team." Marissa tilted her head at the mention. "France? I wasn't briefed on that." One of her staffers shrugged. "Maybe someone added them last minute. Could be part of the bilateral agreement team." She didn't press it. There were always small changes, last-minute switches in the schedule, generals who popped in unannounced. Her focus was on appearances. As long as everything ran on time and the champagne flowed, no one would ask why someone wasn't allowed inside just for wearing a uniform. After all, they'd curated every detail of this event. Custom lighting, flawless branding, Air Force decals in muted chrome to match the minimalist interior. But what they hadn't accounted for, what they couldn't have predicted, was that the same woman they'd quietly pushed out didn't vanish. She had a keycard to a hangar an hour away. She had clearance signed off by 2 joint military commands. She had 47 logged hours in the very aircraft they'd listed as the surprise for tomorrow. And she wasn't coming to make a point. She was coming to remind them what they forgot. But they were too busy curating optics to realize the real show had already been set in motion. The hangar was quiet except for the faint buzz of overhead lights and the occasional sound of tools clinking from the maintenance bay. An hour outside of Tonopah, near an auxiliary military airstrip, it wasn't much to look at from the outside. But inside, it housed something rare. A Dassault Rafale on loan through the Multinational Joint Readiness Exchange program. Tameka stood just outside the flight line, her boots grinding into the packed dirt as a mechanic walked the length of the plane, clipboard in hand. She'd driven through the night after Lefebvre's call. The colonel had done more than pull a few strings. He'd cleared the entire chain. The Rafale was officially listed for tomorrow's flyby, with one condition. Tameka was flying it. She didn't waste a second. Inside the small flight operations room, she ran through the checklist like her body remembered it better than her mind. There was a rhythm to it. Throttle, fuel flow, control surfaces. The Rafale wasn't a machine you could fake. It responded to confidence. Hesitate for a second, and it would buck on you. "You're really flying this thing tomorrow?" asked Staff Sergeant Mark Bledsoe, who had been assigned to liaise with foreign pilots during the demo. He was maybe 30, sharp-eyed, quiet. "That a problem?" she asked without looking up from her checklist. "No, ma'am," he said quickly. "Just didn't expect the pilot to be... well, you." She looked at him now. He didn't flinch, but he looked like he wished he hadn't said it. "That's all right," she said. "They didn't expect it either." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask. At 4:20 a.m., she suited up. By 5:05, the Rafale was moved to the holding area, and by 6:30, her helmet was tucked under her arm, and she was walking across the tarmac under a slow pink sky. Her heart wasn't racing. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't war. This was personal. 1,000 times she'd walked across airfields. In the Middle East. In Europe. In the blistering heat of South Texas. But something about today made each step feel heavier. Back at the conference, they were still sipping espressos and prepping name badges. Someone was checking the drone display for the 3rd time. Someone else was updating a PowerPoint for a panel called Next Gen Allies, Pilots, Programming, and Possibilities. None of them knew what was coming. At 7:11 a.m., she stood on the final steps of the ladder, looked out across the flat, open stretch of the airstrip, and pulled her helmet down. She didn't say a word to the crew. She just climbed into the cockpit like she'd been doing it for years. Because she had. Inside, the familiar hum of systems spinning up greeted her like an old friend. Her fingers moved across the console as her headset crackled to life. "Control, this is Sierra 1 requesting runway 23 for clearance." "Copy Sierra 1, cleared for taxi." Tameka slid the throttle forward, and the Rafale rolled into position with a grace that belied its strength. At 7:19, she was airborne. The Nevada desert opened up beneath her, vast and indifferent. The sky above was clean, wide, and hers. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even angry anymore. She just wanted them to see what they turned away, see what they thought didn't belong, see what it really meant to wear a flight suit, not as a costume, but as a second skin molded by years of fire and pressure. But they still had no idea who had just taken off, or what she was about to show them. Back when she first touched the Rafale's controls, she'd been intimidated, though she'd never admit it out loud. This wasn't the standard issue F-16 or the rugged A-10 she'd trained on in the early years. The Rafale was different. Sleek, responsive, unapologetically precise. Every movement had to be deliberate, every decision made before instinct even caught up. Her first week in Saint-Dizier, France had been brutal. She was jet-lagged, alone, and the only American on base. The French pilots weren't unkind, but they weren't overly welcoming either. Her presence was tolerated, not celebrated. One of them, Capitaine Julien Moreau, had questioned why she was even there. "Americans already have the F-22, no? Why borrow our bird?" he said over lunch. She had stared at him for a second. "To learn what the F-22 can't teach," she replied. He'd raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything else. That night, she spent 4 extra hours in the simulator after everyone had gone home. Her turning point came 3 weeks later. They were running a 2-jet mock interception exercise over the Pyrenees. The weather was a mess, high crosswinds and scattered cloud cover. Midway through the drill, Moreau's systems began to glitch. His targeting display blanked, and his radar went haywire. She was trailing him by just under 2 kilometers. "Daniels, I have system failure," he said over the radio. "I'm blind." He was flying at over 500 knots with limited visibility, skimming mountain ridges with barely enough buffer to recover from a mistake. One wrong pitch, one late correction, and he'd slam into a rock face. Tamika didn't panic. She dropped altitude, slid alongside him, and guided him out of the pass using nothing but visual cues and calm, steady voice commands. When they landed, Moreau didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled off his helmet, walked over, and extended his hand. "Merci," he said. "You fly better than half my squadron." She didn't smile. She just said, "That's the idea." After that, she wasn't the American. She was Daniels. She was a pilot. Full stop. Her hours behind the stick grew. She ran air combat maneuvers over the Mediterranean, tested radar cloaking patterns in French airspace, logged night flights that had her charting paths by instrument only, stars swallowed by cloud. Each session left her sharper, calmer, more dangerous. And now, thousands of miles and nearly 2 years later, she was back in the same jet. Different terrain. Same grit. As she sliced through the open Nevada sky, she ran a tight circuit. North over the flatlands, west near Goldfield, banking south as the sun pushed higher in the sky. Everything in her body synced with the plane. Left wrist twitch for roll, right hand feathering throttle, eyes scanning, calculating. Back at the conference, they'd just started funneling guests to the outdoor observation platform. It was a spacious terrace lined with polished steel rails and information boards. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged for the flyby. People filed out, clutching coffee cups, wearing lanyard, squinting into the distance. One of the junior flight analysts from the Canadian F-35 team pulled out a pair of binoculars. "Hey, that's not one of ours," he muttered. The jet was just a blur at first. Low, fast, loud. Someone pulled up the schedule on their phone. "No, that's not... Wait. France isn't due till 10:45, right?" "Yeah," another guy said. But they didn't say who was flying. Tamika checked her heading and pulled slightly left. Her helmet display reflected back her vitals. Steady, balanced. She thought briefly about the woman at registration. The stiff smile. The look that said, "You don't belong here. Not in uniform. Not in this world." She gripped the controls tighter. They had no idea what it cost to earn this seat. What it meant to spend years being told, almost good enough, and still show up, sharpened. But she wasn't coming in quietly. She was about to speak the only way they'd understand, with jet fuel, precision turns, and silence too loud to ignore. The desert heat was already rising by 9:45 a.m., warping the air above the tarmac in faint waves. Guests gathered along the edge of the platform, adjusting sunglasses and murmuring about the updated flight schedule. No one knew exactly who the pilot for the French demonstration would be. Most assumed it would be someone from Saint-Dizier or Mont-de-Marsan, maybe a visiting European official. Marissa Givens stood with two senior executives from Echelon Aerotech, clipboard in hand, checking off names and slots. Everything was running 2 minutes ahead. She liked that. On schedule meant in control. The flight announcer, a retired Navy pilot named Al Kendrick, cleared his throat and stepped up to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, in approximately 10 minutes, you'll witness a joint demo featuring aircraft from multiple allied nations. Please remember, all flight patterns are cleared by both the FAA and Department of Defense. Keep your eyes on the sky and prepare for a show. People clapped lightly. Brian Qualls stood near the back, holding his phone like he was checking email, but really just trying to avoid eye contact. He hadn't seen Tamika again since yesterday, and part of him kept wondering if maybe she'd left town. Maybe she'd let it slide, but something told him she wasn't built like that. Out past the hangars, beyond the hills, a distant echo began to crawl across the sky. At first it was just a low rumble. A few attendees squinted. "Is that us?" someone asked. Kendrick frowned and checked his headset. No signal yet from the tower. The Canadians were scheduled next. But this was coming in too fast. And too low. Suddenly a dot broke the horizon, moving faster than anything they'd seen that morning. No contrails, just heat shimmer and speed. The crowd fell into silence. The Rafale came into view like a blade. No banners, no announcement. Just clean, surgical entry into restricted airspace at just under Mach 1. Marissa stepped forward, alarm rising in her throat. "Who the hell is that?" A systems officer beside her muttered. "That's not Canadian. That's not on the list." Brian lowered his phone. "Oh my God," he whispered. The aircraft banked left, then dropped altitude just enough to skim the edge of the field. It wasn't reckless. It was precise. Perfect lines. A practiced rhythm. She wasn't showing off. She was demonstrating what mastery looked like. Kendrick was frozen. The executive next to Marissa leaned in. "That's a Rafale. Who's flying it?" But before anyone could answer, the jet hit a perfect vertical climb, flipped in a half loop, and descended with controlled aggression right over the crowd. People gasped. A few applauded instinctively. Someone near the rail shouted, "Who is that?" The Rafale sliced across the sky again, this time flying inverted, tail angled slightly upward. Cameras snapped. Phones recorded. No one had planned for this. No one was sitting anymore. Then, just as smoothly as it had entered, the aircraft climbed high, reduced throttle, and disappeared briefly into the sun's glare. The announcer's headset finally crackled to life. A voice from the tower came through. "Control to platform, be advised. Rafale flyby is part of authorized NATO display. Pilot clearance confirmed." "Name of the pilot?" Kendrick asked. A pause. Then, "Major Tamika Daniels, U.S. Air Force, attached to NATO liaison." The crowd murmured. A few people turned. Marissa's expression dropped. She didn't speak. Down at the end of the viewing platform, Brian just smiled to himself. Because in that moment, there was no more confusion, no more side glances or polite dismissals. She had come back, and she'd brought the sky with her. But no one was prepared for what would happen when the plane finally landed. Tamika brought the Rafale down fast but smooth, her gloved fingers steady as she touched the throttle. The control tower had already cleared runway 16. She knew the layout by memory, every crack in the tarmac, every blind spot in the approach. Her shadow raced ahead of her on the dirt beside the airstrip, growing longer as she dropped altitude. As the landing gear locked into place, the nose dipped with precision. The jet kissed the ground at just the right angle, tires screeching for a split second before gripping hard. She let the momentum roll out, slowing down as she taxied toward the staging area. On the platform, no one had moved. The applause had faded into murmurs, whispers passing from one executive to another. It wasn't just the skill, it was the fact that none of them knew this was coming, and none of them could pretend it wasn't impressive. "Who signed off on this?" one of the Echelon executives demanded, his voice low but sharp. "The Department of Defense." A staffer answered. "It's a joint program. It's all above board." "But why wasn't this in our materials?" "It was. You just didn't read the appendix." Back on the field, the jet eased to a full stop. Tamika cut the engine, flipped off her comms, and sat in silence for one long breath. Then she popped the canopy. Hot desert air flooded in. She reached for her helmet strap, loosened it, and slowly lifted it off. Sweat clung to her hairline, but her eyes were calm. She climbed down the ladder step by step. Each boot hit metal like a drumbeat. She moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how many people were watching, but didn't care if they clapped or not. As she hit the tarmac, the silence was deafening. No announcements, no introductions, just the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't need to say a word to be heard. Marissa Givens was standing at the edge of the staging area with a tight smile and sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the shift in her expression. Tamika walked toward the group, her helmet tucked under her arm, her suit zipped to the collar, patches catching the morning light. She stopped right in front of them. The same man who'd waved her off the day before, clipboard in hand, tried to recover his composure. "Well," he said with a forced chuckle, "you sure made an entrance." Tamika looked at him. No smile, no reply. Just long enough for him to drop his eyes to the ground. Brian, still standing near the rear of the crowd, caught that moment. And for him, it was like watching something crack wide open. One of those small, private victories no one can ever fully explain to someone who didn't grow up needing them. One of the younger analysts turned to his colleague and asked, "Wait, she was the one they wouldn't let in yesterday." "Yeah," the guy said, almost under his breath. "That's her." The crowd began to applaud, not the awkward, scattered kind, but a building wave of genuine respect. People stood up. A few shook their heads in disbelief. She had flown in unannounced, flown better than half of them had ever seen, and landed without a scratch. A woman in a dark blue pantsuit stepped forward, Colonel Reyes from Air Mobility Command. She was the only other high-ranking military officer in attendance. "Major Daniels," she said, offering her hand. Tamika shook it. "That was one hell of a maneuver." "Just keeping the flight hours up, ma'am." Reyes smiled. "Let me know next time you want to crash a party. I'll bring popcorn." Tamika gave the smallest laugh, just a half-second flicker, and turned back toward the jet. She wasn't there for a speech. She didn't need to explain herself. She'd already said everything that needed saying, from 30,000 feet in the air, but the real echo of her flight hadn't hit them yet, and it was about to start inside their own walls. The rest of the demonstrations that day went ahead, but something had shifted. Every pilot who followed knew they were stepping onto a stage that had already been burned into memory. The Canadians flew sharp. The Italians brought their twin-engine beauty with grace. But nothing matched the roar, the defiance, and the control they'd witnessed from the Rafale, from her. Inside the main conference hall, the atmosphere felt different, lighter in some corners, heavier in others. Executives who'd barely registered Tamika's name the day before now tossed it around in hallway conversations. "Daniels, right? She flew that Rafale like it was born in her hands. She American or French trained? She's Air Force, Joint NATO Training Program. I didn't know we had black women flying at that level." The last one didn't come from a place of malice. It was said plainly, honestly. That made it worse. Brian heard it and clenched his jaw, but didn't say anything. Not yet. He just kept walking, holding a tablet and pretending to look busy. Marissa Givens had slipped into one of the corner offices upstairs. The blinds were drawn halfway, the AC humming in the background. She scrolled through her tablet, checking the press coverage as it rolled in. Unexpected highlight of the conference. Rafale flown by U.S. Major steals the show. Unlisted pilot stuns crowd with precision flyover. She didn't open the articles. She didn't need to. Her inbox was already filling up with CCs and forwards and subject lines like, "Need clarification on scheduling oversight." Outside the window, the airstrip still shimmered. Tamika's Rafale had already been wheeled back to the hangar. There was nothing else left to do. But the silence wouldn't go away. The silence wasn't punishment. It was recognition. It was the absence of doubt. The removal of excuse. Back near the expo floor, Brian stood beside a scale model of a VTOL drone. A woman, maybe late 40s, walked over. She wore a badge from a Canadian aerospace firm and had caught the tail end of the Rafale's arrival. "You work here?" she asked. He nodded. "Do you know the pilot? That woman from this morning?" "I've met her," Brian said. "Briefly." She looked at the model, then back at him. "They asked her to leave yesterday, didn't they?" He hesitated. "Yeah." She let out a breath. "You know, I've been doing this for 2 decades, and I've seen a lot of talent ignored because it didn't wear the right skin or come from the right zip code. That? What she did? That wasn't for the room. That was for every room that ever tried to shrink her." Brian didn't respond. He just nodded and turned the name badge on his chest so it was clearly visible. For once, he wanted them to see him too. Back at the temporary hangar, Tamika sat alone with a water bottle in hand, staring out the open door as dust rolled across the tarmac. Staff Sergeant Bledsoe approached cautiously, holding a small folder. "Ma'am, these came in for you. Debrief notes. And, this too." He handed her a sealed envelope. Official Air Force letterhead. She didn't open it, just nodded and set it on the bench beside her. "You really shook them up out there," he said. "I wasn't trying to," she replied. "Maybe not, but sometimes people need to be shaken." He paused before walking away. Tamika leaned back against the wall, letting her head rest for a second. She wasn't tired. She wasn't angry. She was done waiting. She thought about her father, about what he'd said when she first declared she wanted to fly. "You'll walk into rooms where no one wants you there, and you'll still have to fly like you belong." She hadn't just flown like she belonged. She'd flown like she owned the sky. But while her flight was over, its impact had just begun to settle inside the people who had once looked straight through her. By the next morning, the internet had already done what it always does, filled in the blanks faster than any PR team could manage. Clips of Tamika's flight made it onto military enthusiast forums, aviation Reddit threads, and even a few LinkedIn posts written by conference attendees who had filmed the demo on their phones. But unlike most viral moments, the tone wasn't mocking or shallow, it was reverent. One post stood out, written by an aerospace engineer from Dallas. "She wasn't on the schedule. She didn't need to be. That Rafale didn't just fly. It made a statement. Some of us are still trying to process it." Back at Echelon Aerotech's headquarters, fallout was brewing. Not because Tamika did anything wrong, but because someone had. Emails had surfaced. Internal memos. A note from a junior event coordinator referencing her presence as a possible distraction before the event even started. The quiet exclusion had been planned, or at least anticipated. The company issued a statement 2 days later. "We honor all service members and are committed to creating a welcoming space. We regret the miscommunication regarding uniform protocol." But no one really believed it. The words felt like a hand over a flame, hoping to cool it down. Too little. Too late. Meanwhile, in San Antonio, Tamika's younger sister, Renee, sat on the couch with her 2 sons, watching a grainy clip of the flyby. The boys, ages 10 and 12, sat wide-eyed. "Wait, that's Aunt Tamika?" the younger one asked, mouth open. Renee smiled. "Yeah, that's her." "She flew that thing over all those people?" "She sure did." The older boy squinted. "Why?" Renee paused. "Because some people forgot who they were talking to." Later that evening, Renee called Tamika. "I just want you to know," she said. "Mum would have cried watching that." "I know," Tamika said softly. "And the boys? They've watched it 6 times already. You're officially cooler than Spider-Man." Tamika laughed. "Took me long enough, but not all the reactions were from family." Colonel Arnaud Lefebvre called again that same week. "I see the Americans are learning your name, finally." He joked. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe they just ran out of excuses." "You didn't have to go that hard, you know." "I know. You did it anyway." "I had to." They paused. Then he said something she wouldn't forget. You reminded them that excellence doesn't need permission. It wasn't a soundbite. It was truth. Back at the base, her squadron welcomed her home the way real teams do, without ceremony, without applause. Just shoulder bumps, bad jokes, and one guy who left a sticky note on her locker that read, "Next time, warn us when you make the news." Brian, back at Echelon, found himself walking differently. Not cocky, just grounded. He updated his profile photo, said no thanks to the next all-hands social, and spent an extra hour each day preparing a pitch for a new drone prototype idea. A few days later, he got a call from the Canadian aerospace rep he'd met on the conference floor. "I remembered your name," she said. "I've got a fellowship program opening up. You might want to look at it." One person's silence had opened space for someone else's voice, not because Tameka fought her way in, but because she flew her way through, literally. And maybe that's what makes stories like hers stick. It's not the noise, it's the clarity, the precision of saying I deserve to be here without ever needing to say it out loud. She didn't demand a seat, she brought her own jet, but her story wasn't about revenge, it was about reminding the world what earned respect really looks like. Tameka never posted about the conference, she didn't go on a podcast, didn't write a think piece, she never even told her story to a reporter, not once. She went back to work. She flew her missions. She kept her hours up. She stayed sharp. Because for her, that moment wasn't the climax of her career. It was a line in the margin, a necessary correction in a system that still asked too many of the wrong questions. Was she qualified? Was she professional? Could she represent the force appropriately? None of those questions mattered once the wheels left the ground and the Rafale responded to every single move like the sky had been waiting for her. That day, the audience saw something they didn't expect. But what they were really looking at wasn't just her skill. It was their own blind spot. All those years of imagining a pilot as someone else. All the quiet assumptions about who deserves space in elite rooms. Tameka shattered that image at 800 miles per hour, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition. Her presence did all the work. And that's what stays with people. Not just her flight, but the way she never begged to be seen. She just made herself undeniable. Not everyone will clap when you show up. Not everyone will open the door, but you can fly straight over that door, land right in front of it, and make sure no one forgets your name. This story isn't just about one woman in a flight suit. It's about anyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, told to wait their turn. Or worse, that their turn would never come. It's for the people who've been asked to shrink themselves so someone else could stay comfortable. It's for the ones who walk into rooms where no one expects them to speak, so they let their work roar. And maybe most of all, it's for the ones still sitting in silence, wondering if it's worth pushing back. Let this be your answer. You don't have to fight the noise, you just have to show them what quiet strength looks like when it finally shows up. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, or reminded you of someone who's had to carve out their place in a world that wasn't built for them, share it. Tell someone. Show your kids. Show your team. Let it echo. And don't forget to subscribe for more true feeling stories that speak louder than noise, because somewhere out there, another door is being closed, and someone else is already preparing to fly over it.